showing us the road, for giving us hope, for showing that there are solutions, and for demonstrating that we can be on a coalition and do much more. Can I now propose to have some minutes for discussion before giving the floor to the next speaker? Who wants to intervene? Professor Ramanathan.
Governor, thank you very much for that uplifting speech. I'm so happy that you emphasized the transformation. This is what this academy has been working towards. And we have some influential faith leaders here, head of the Evangelical Church and then the English Church and Catholics. Do you have some particular way we can get started on this between the sciences and faith leaders?
Well, I would certainly like to see the religious leaders be present at these meetings, like the Conference of the Parties, as they take place each year, the other interim meetings that are going on. I would like to see the patriarchs in Christian Orthodoxy, the Islamic leaders, the Jewish leaders, the Hindu leaders, the Muslims leaders. I think the faith element is underdeveloped as an ingredient in climate change solutions. And I can tell you, as I read the documents leading up to the Conference of the Parties, that language is so opaque, so abstract, so bureaucratic, that there's no way, I might say there's no way in hell that that's going to motivate people. It's going to take a clear, prophetic voice. And if we could think of the words from the gospel, since I'm starting to use a little of that here now that I'm in the proper building, but speaking with authority and having your yes, yes, and your no, no, that is not what goes on in diplomacy. It's just quite the opposite. Nobody speaks with authority. They speak with multiple forked tongues. And we need the clarity and the conviction that the faith community and faith leaders can bring to this equation. So I would say it's barely begun as far as the intervention of the religious leaders of the world. And I would just encourage that to the maximum degree.
Any other intervention? Professor Guarnieri?
I have to say, after listening to Senator DeLeon, talking with Scott Peters, and now you, Governor Brown, I'm so happy to be paying California taxes. Up until this point, I was hesitant. We talked a lot about air pollution and the impacts that we're making in California, which is extraordinary. I wonder if you can speak for a few minutes to the fact that we are one of the breadbaskets of the world. We have huge agricultural community, and if there's any plans, any way that you're thinking about how we can enhance our sustainable agriculture, how we can get back to the small farms, move away from these monocultures, and really start to support our migrant workers and produce the food that we need locally. Going back to your question about how much do we bring in and how much do we keep at home?
Well, you set out quite a topic. I would say we're making taking very serious steps on the management of water. We have now a management of underground water, which has been overexploited for decades. We have been raising the wages for farm laborers, but of course we're involved in this global competition. So the extent that costs go up, production will move to Mexico and lower cost markets. So we are challenged. There's not a local solution here. We have to work together to work these things out. We have probably the most comprehensive pesticide regulation program anywhere. But that doesn't say that we understand the effects of all the chemicals that are circulating around, whether they're on the farms, residues on the food, or the tens of thousands of chemicals just in the commercial stream of commerce. There's a lot to be done. We are doing that. We have a Proposition 65, which highlights whenever there are reproductive toxins or carcinogens. So there's a lot going on, but how big a farm should be, or how diverse the production process ought to be, those are real questions. I don't think that Wendell Berry and his farm is going to substitute for these huge agricultural structures that are producing the food. We now have 7.3 billion people. Like it or not, we only make it by technology. I've criticized the notion that technology is the solution. It's one of the core solutions, but we have to find a way to feed people, and there are people that are starving by the hundreds of millions. And so the seeds, I think there's only 100 plants on which most food is produced in the world. So there's a lot to be done, and I don't think I'll say any more than that, because this is a topic that you could have an entire conference on, just food production and all the different angles of that. So California is working on, I think we are pretty advanced. But again, I want to emphasize, relative to the problem, our efforts are either embryonic, minor, or just in the beginning stages. So the pathway of transformation needed to prevent human catastrophe, we're only beginning down that pathway. And I think our own prosperity here, the good food that we eat, the warmth, the availability of high speed. I was thinking about this on the ride over the ocean. I'm flying over the ocean on this jet plane, and I was hoping that it was going to keep going until we landed. I always think about that because it's kind of a mystery to me how it all works. So technology has a power, and we have to somehow harness that power, take into account this mysterious interconnection of things, the pattern that connects us. And that's true in agriculture, very much so. But that's a whole nother topic. In fact, there's so much to think about. I don't know how the hell we ever get it done, because everywhere I look, I see complexity, and I see very, very big challenges. But we are, the glass is, what is it? I think it's just a little more than half full and a little bit, so that's good.
Thank you. President Van Rompuy, and then.
Governor Brown, thank you for the energy which you bring into this room and to the issues before us. The transformation, how will the end game look like? We have discussed the circular economy, a bio-based economy, which brings people and nature back closer to harmony here. And you have laid out the elements, the pathway to get there. What role private sector? What role corporate sector? What role Silicon Valley? Artificial intelligence and robotics? The leadership of that industry currently doesn't seem to be in line with the transformation we have been talking about. Maybe you can comment a bit on that. They are very important global stakeholders, also to include the poorest, who are not yet connected, the 3 billion who are not yet connected. We had a conference on that here. But more generally, role of private sector, how can we include them, and are you including them? Thank you.
Well, often we think something in the private sector is going to help. For example, people said social media will make for more democracy. And then all of a sudden we're finding out that social media can also undermine democracy by all the false memes that are set in motion at rapid rates of speed. Technology is this two-edged sword, because the elements that make for good also make for bad. Artificial intelligence, at the same kind of scientists are working on synthetic life, on this notion of a singularity. There's going to be a time when not only life is created, but it becomes autonomous. This is not a science fiction. There are actual people, and sometimes people in intelligence agencies that we're not supposed to know about, are doing these kind of things. That's why very thoughtful people, and I would cite one, Martin Rees from the United Kingdom, was the royal astronomer for many years. He said that humanity only has a 50% chance of getting to the end of this century, 50%. So the stakes are very, very high. And what will bring us down will be the science. But also, a key part of the solution is also science. So getting hold of this before it gets hold of us, that is the challenge. And the science and the market are not going to listen to the church. They're going to listen to what they understand. And what they understand is the unstoppable quest for more knowledge and information and more technology, or more profits and more markets. So that dynamic is so powerful that we have our work cut out for us to temper it, to shape it, and to move in a direction by which we reap the benefits of this technological prowess. And we have to reap the benefits because the world with over 7 billion is not a world that can exist on the same terms when it was 1 billion. And I believe from the first billion didn't occur on planet Earth till sometime in the 19th century. And since that time, we've grown so quickly. And in California, we know that native peoples have been around for at least 12,000 years, and there's carbon dating that suggests there were native villages and people 20,000 years ago. But the numbers of those native people in California, what is now California, never exceeded 300,000, maybe more than that. So for 20,000 years, possibly, the ecology taught human beings that about 300,000 people was about the right amount. Now we have 40 million. We have 40 million, and we have 32 million vehicles, and the vehicle reproduction is even faster now than the human reproduction. Just chart how fast cars grow and how fast people grow, and the cars are outrunning the people, at least in most years. So all that's to say that we need science. We can't go back to the loincloth. We got to go forward, but as we go forward, it gets more dangerous the more power we have. In fact, I would like to mention a graph that I like to share with people. And if you think of a graph, and you have one curve that goes up like this, that's the curve of power, the curve of technological innovation. Okay, that's moving at a positive rate of change. All right, there's another curve, and that curve is totally flat. This is the curve of wisdom, the curve of self-restraint, the curve of curbing our 7 deadly sins. And the two most important in the early church, greed was the first. St. Paul said greed is the number one. But then in the medieval church, as capitalism started to rear its ugly head, we got greed. But just if we could deal with greed and pride, that'd take us a long way. But we're not too good at that. And so we have the same limited sensibility or ability to discern how to behave and what to do, but the toys, the tools, if I could call them that, the technologies get ever more powerful. So the consequences of our sins are far more serious. Before, it was just a few thousand here, a country there, or a civilization over there. Now we're talking about not only human existence, but we're talking all mammalian species. We're talking about most of life is all at risk. And if it doesn't happen through climate change, it'll happen through a nuclear exchange or one of these other devices that are being developed. So the human race is on a trajectory to either enhanced, enlightened living together with an appreciation of the beauty of creation or absolute destruction. So there it is. I don't have the full answer, but I do have, at least I know where to look for it. And I think we're in the right place, and we better work harder because we're not getting there yet. But I'm hopeful. Remember, great doubt, great faith, and great commitment. We follow those three, we'll get it done.
Thank you, Governor. I have the request for 3 more questions and then we close. But on your curve of wisdom, there is hope. Look at the 2 beautiful children using a fantastic technological tool, a book. Look at that. So there is some hope there. Yes. Marcelo, please.
Thank you, Governor. Last night you began your reflections with standard political stump speech, quoting St. Thomas Aquinas. What is good diffuses. And apropos of your last comment, the great H.G. Wells said 150 years ago, history is now become a race between education and catastrophe. So here you are the governor of the state. Here we have 2 children with the largest school system in the United States. What then, Mr. Governor, how are you thinking about the public education system in the state of California, qua bringing to children the agency, the moral tools, the beauty of the scientific method for them to engage from a very early age with these defining existential issues of our time: sustainability, climate change, the massive displacements of human beings. How then do we align the extraordinary advances the state of California has made in the environment with similar advances in the education of all the children of California?
Oh, that's a very good question. Unfortunately, education, or maybe not, unfortunately or not, the fact is education is embedded in the culture. And all the pathologies which we are discussing and which we face are embedded in the educational system. So the system reproduces our current way of being and views of the world. So to ask somehow the education system to become the outsider and to call us to account and to wake us up toward a new path, I think that is difficult. I think that schools can instill an appreciation for evidence, for beauty, for truth, for research, for discussion. But I think this goes much deeper. We have to understand the pathologies that we now currently believe are virtues. And often what we think is a virtue is actually a vice. And that becomes very problematic if you're going to start putting this into schools. So I would say the school system has a rather modest function, and that's to teach the skills, intellectual, social, and evidence-based, and the best knowledge we can. But I would say it's going to be political leadership, cultural leadership, artistic leadership, religious leadership. All that will have to shape our culture. and the schools follow culture rather than lead culture. And so that's why you can't, people say it's the schools. More education will change. The trouble is education for what? And education is furthering some of the very pathologies that we're trying to correct. And so education has to be transformed along with the politics, along with the churches, along with the scientific academies, along with our universities. So I would say that, maybe what I would recommend for education at all levels is a dose of humility to understand that we're dealing with something profoundly important, young minds, youthful minds, and we ought to really be very careful of what we're doing and reflect on how we can make it better, as opposed to this self-congratulatory, we're the greatest, we're the best. I think there's too much of that, and it reminds me of somebody whistling in the dark, that we're trying to ward off the specter that we're up against by telling ourselves we're better and we're on a more sustainable path than we really are. So I would just say about education, we should be, I think, humble about what we're doing, because education is full of fads, and what works in one decade is changed another decade, and there's a lot of churning going on that is very reflective of the modern economy and change and innovation. And what I'm saying is you need innovation, but you also need continuity. You need tradition, but you also need change. You need imagination, but you also need rigor. And the problem is it's always one or the other. And I would like to just, in terms of education, I'd like to say, if all we have is rigor in our schools, we have rigor mortis. We have paralytic death. If all we have is imagination, we have insanity. But if we have imagination and rigor, then we have the chance of wisdom and a sustainable future.
I'm going to be ethnocentric here for a minute and talk about America, since we are both high emitters and a drag on change, other than in California. The American people want change when we look at the polls, but our problem is the politics. And I wonder, can you share thoughts about how you would shape a transformative political leadership?
How I would shape a transformative, listen, I have enough trouble shaping my own political leadership. Generalizing that, I don't know that there's, would you repeat that question again?
What are your thoughts about shaping transformative political leadership in America so that we can end the logjam and get people who represent both the needs of their constituents and the needs of the larger world?
Well, let me interpret that by picking out one of the political problems, and that's the increase in the partisan divide, the partisan polarization. It's by most recent measures, empirical measures, the Republicans are getting further apart from the Democrats. On many key questions, the difference between Republicans and Democrats is far greater than it was even 30 years ago. So I would say that a very important step would be to find ways to bring the parties together on some issues. For example, when there's a disaster, the parties often work together. President Trump has been very helpful to California. The Republican members of the delegation would not join in a letter with the other Democrats to ask for federal relief, but they did write me a letter saying they thought it was a good idea that we ask for relief. So that was almost a joining together. But that indicates how difficult it is. So whether it's the tax bill or any of these other, the energy bill, I don't say we're going to get 100% agreement. We have two parties, we have two tendencies, and never the two are going to be conjoined. But I do think the path of improvement, much less transformation, lies along a path of some cooperation, increasing cooperation across the party lines. And we know that if we look to history, when parties become so rigid, they don't collaborate. And at the same time, then you get stalemate, and and drift, and then more radical parties with more urgency and more coherence rise to the fore. So it's very important that people of goodwill in, say, in America, in Republican and Democrat, find ways where they can come together and agree on an increasing number of things. Now, that's not happening now, but I think it can happen. And in many ways, I think that the extreme direction taken by President Trump is creating a situation of reductio ad absurdum. And by that I mean, when you go something too far, its absurdity becomes evident, and then people pull back. And I think you're seeing some Republican leaders that may be able to cooperate with some Democratic leaders on some topics. And I think that's very important, and that's a very practical sequence of steps that would lead us in a more positive direction than the one we're in right now.
Monsignor, you have the last question before we...
Governor, you are just the governor of one of the more important regions of the Pacific and the capital, one of the capital of the Pacific. What about the other protagonists of the Pacific in this moment? What do you think about this new scenario of the Pacific?
Which part of the Pacific? Do you mean China or Oregon?
Well, both.
What?
Both.
Both. The Pacific. Well, I don't want to overstate the Pacific as opposed to the Atlantic. I mean, if you look at China, at 1.3 billion, that's a lot of people. But if you look at the Western Hemisphere, North and South America, that's 700 million people. And if you look at Europe, that's another 700 million people. That's 1.4 billion. 1.4 billion is a lot of people. So that's important. No doubt, China and India are because of their power, their people, when they become transformed, and if they have a way of life like America, well, then it's all over. So those countries have to transform and have to change how they operate, and they're getting the feedbacks today. I don't know how many of you saw it. A report came out, it was in The Guardian, about a 3 centigrade world that we're going to have, and they listed who's going to suffer. Shanghai was one of those cities. Miami was one of those cities. There were several other. Real people in real time are going to suffer. So based on that increasing scientific recognition, China and other coastal countries are going to respond, and they are responding. If you just think of where we were just a few years ago, Oregon and Washington are doing more. China's doing more. India itself has come further in terms of its commitment to renewable energy. So I would say that the Pacific is growing faster. I mean, that is a very dynamic part of the world, India and China in particular, but other parts of Asia. So that they have to be key leaders in this transformation, or we're not going to get it done. So we're here in the eternal city, but the Pacific is where a lot of the decision is going to be made, for good or for ill. So I do think that there are positive developments in the Pacific, but the Pacific is also Russia, and the Pacific is North Korea and South Korea and all these, and Burma. So there's a lot going on over there, and like some of the other questions, I think I'll leave it at that.